It was supposed to be a night of celebration. The company party had been carefully planned to end the year on a high note. Smiles filled the room, glasses clinked and the smell of success was in the air. I, standing next to the boss, felt every muscle in my body tense, but the expression on my face remained neutral, almost professional. Everyone was waiting for that moment when he would take the microphone and, with his usual confidence, close the speeches. But at that moment, he looked at me, seeking the silent confirmation we had rehearsed. A slight nod was enough. "The last announcement of the evening is a personal one," he began, his firm voice echoing through the hall. The side conversation ceased, the attention was now completely on us. "It is with a heavy heart that I inform you that our colleague here, one of the pillars of our team, is getting divorced. Unfortunately, the reason is betrayal." The shock was palpable. Murmurs broke out among the guests, curious eyes turned to me, to her. My wife, until then impeccably radiant, was motionless. Her fingers trembled slightly around the wine glass she had barely touched. Her once confident face lost color in seconds. She knew there was no turning back from there. The room seemed to shrink. The awkward silence gave way to louder whispers. I didn't need to look to confirm it, but I could feel every gaze fixed on both of us. She tried to get closer, babbling, "Why are you doing this here? Why like this?" Her voice was low, desperate, while her eyes begged for some mercy that I had no intention of offering. "Do you think you still deserve privacy after what you've done?" The question cut through the air like a blade. My voice was cold, controlled. "Here, in front of everyone, maybe you'll understand the extent of what you've destroyed." She stepped back, stunned, while I stood my ground. But what seemed like an act of public revenge was only the beginning. Every look of pity directed at me was fuel. It wasn't just any betrayal, it was betrayal. The kind that tears you apart inside, that rips away pieces of the trust you've spent years building. I'd known everything for weeks. The lover, the meetings, the carefully articulated lies. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together, the hastily deleted messages, the poorly worded apologies, the strange perfume she brought home. It wasn't just her actions, it was the coldness with which she hid them. As if I didn't even deserve the truth. One memory in particular consumed me. Her smile during the birthday dinner I organized for us. That day, while I was toasting to love and partnership, she had already shared that same smile with someone else. Physical betrayal is one thing, but emotional betrayal? Knowing that someone else was taking the place that I believed was mine. That burned me more than any other kind of pain. "You destroyed me," I whispered, more to myself than to her, as the party turned into a scene of controlled chaos. "And now you can feel what it's like to lose something that can't be recovered." I walked away, letting the weight of her actions come crashing down on her. But while this was happening, a secret she thought was well kept was about to be revealed. It wasn't just her heart she had betrayed. There was something else, something so disgusting that just thinking about it made me nauseous. And when everyone found out what was really behind her lies, it wouldn't just be looks that condemned her. It would be the whole world. The question is, how does someone get to the point where they choose to destroy the home they've built? What makes someone look their partner in the eye and lie, knowing that the other person would never question their loyalty? I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for justice. Now, as I watched the shocked and curious expressions in the hall, a single question hung in the air: what would be the next move? What else could be revealed that night that already seemed to have been ripped from a cruel script? And when we finally get to the bottom of this story, will there be anything left but ashes to start again? Welcome to our channel. Here, we don't tolerate any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives and hearts. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of twists and turns, where every decision will have consequences. Now sit back and immerse yourself in a shocking story that will hold your attention until the very last moment. Happy listening. Michael has always been a dedicated man. From the start of his relationship with Emily, his priority was to build something solid, something that would withstand the storms of life. He was methodical, a born planner, the kind of person who never left room for improvisation. This was reflected in both his personal and professional life. At 35, Michael held a respectable position in a large technology company, where he was known for his efficiency and reliability. But, deep down, what drove him was the idea of offering Emily a quiet life, free from worries. Emily, on the other hand, was the opposite. She had a free spirit, an almost contagious passion for life. When they met, she was working as a freelance photographer, capturing moments from weddings, events and family sessions. Her spontaneity was what first attracted Michael to her. While he lived under the dictatorship of planning, she showed how it was possible to find beauty in the unexpected. Together, they formed what many would call the perfect balance. He brought stability, and she, lightness. The house they bought after their wedding was a reflection of this combination. A townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden that Emily tended with dedication. While Michael spent hours at the office or on business trips, Emily filled her days with her photography and small personal projects. They had friends in common, liked to gather people at home for dinners or game nights, and always seemed to be the couple that others admired. On the outside, everything was impeccable. But perfection is always superficial. Michael, despite being a man of principle, carried a certain rigidity that, over time, began to weigh on their relationship. He found it difficult to show affection in a spontaneous way, something that Emily valued very much. On the other hand, Emily, with her incessant search for novelty and excitement, sometimes left Michael feeling inadequate, as if he was incapable of offering the kind of life she really wanted. However, none of these small cracks seemed to be enough to shake the structure they had built. That week, Michael was more excited than usual. Planning the company's annual party occupied his thoughts, and he saw the event as an opportunity not only to strengthen professional ties, but also to show Emily how proud he was of his career. "You're going to love the party this year," he said, as he leafed through the menu he had helped select. Emily smiled, but something in the depths of her eyes seemed distant. Over the last few months, there had been a restlessness in Emily that she herself couldn't explain. Her photographs didn't excite her as much as they used to, and the glow of her life with Michael seemed more like an echo from the past. She tried to mask this feeling, concentrating on the preparations for the company party and the small gestures of affection that she knew Michael appreciated. But inside her, an emptiness was growing. On the morning of the party, Michael woke up early, as usual. He organized his schedule to make sure everything went perfectly. Emily, on the other hand, stayed in bed for a few more minutes, staring at the ceiling and wondering how they had got there. She remembered the time when mornings began with long, lazy conversations, laughter and plans. Now, they seemed like two strangers sharing the same space. "Is everything all right?" Michael asked, noticing Emily's pensive countenance as she went down to breakfast. "Of course," she replied with a rehearsed smile. "I'm just thinking about what I'm going to wear tonight." "You're going to look amazing, as always," he said, trying to cheer her up. But even in his words of affection, there was a practical, almost automatic tone that only reinforced the disconnection Emily felt. Throughout the day, Michael divided himself between meetings and final adjustments for the party. He was eager to introduce Emily to colleagues who hadn't met her before, certain that she would be the center of attention with her captivating personality. Emily, for her part, spent the day immersed in thought. When she looked in the mirror after finishing getting ready, she felt a tightness in her chest. The reflection showed someone who, in a way, seemed to have lost her way. At the party, the atmosphere was impeccable. Soft lights illuminated the room, and the sound of conversation and laughter filled the space. Michael, as expected, was in control. He greeted colleagues, made introductions and circulated around the room like the perfect host. Emily was by his side, smiling and fulfilling her role, but she felt like she was watching everything from the sidelines, like a spectator of her own life. The moment when everything began to change came almost imperceptibly. Emily noticed a different look on Michael's face, a seriousness that he rarely displayed at social events. He seemed to carry a weight that was unusual in his always confident posture. And when he took to the stage to speak, the silence that spread through the hall was denser than she had expected. As Michael thanked the team for their hard work over the year, his voice was firm, but there was an underlying tension. Emily watched every movement, every word, sensing that something was out of place. It was as if the ground was about to collapse beneath her feet, but she didn't know exactly why. The announcement, when it came, was like an explosion. Everyone in the room, including Emily, was paralyzed, trying to process what they had just heard. But in that instant, Michael kept his gaze fixed, unwavering, as murmurs began to fill the empty space left by his words. The building of years, the shared memories, the moments that were supposed to be unbreakable, everything seemed on the verge of falling apart. But what nobody knew was that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, there were deeper secrets, layers of buried truths that were about to come to light, changing the course of their lives forever. The muffled sound of Michael's footsteps echoed down the hallway of their home that morning as he adjusted his tie in front of the bedroom mirror. There was an uncomfortable feeling in the air, a tension he couldn't identify, but which seemed to cling to his every gesture. Emily was still asleep, her body wrapped in the sheet as if she were trying to hide from the world. He looked at her for a moment before leaving, as he did every morning, but this time his gaze lasted a little longer. Something in him seemed to hesitate, but he soon left, leaving the silent room behind. The day at the office was heavy. Michael found himself distracted at times when he would normally have been completely immersed in his work. The conversations from the party still echoed in his head. The glances, the whispers, everything seemed to be caught in an unbreakable cycle. He tried to concentrate, but there was a growing restlessness, a discomfort that wouldn't let him. Something was wrong, and although he didn't have the words to describe it, the feeling was clear. Emily, on the other hand, spent the day in the studio, trying to concentrate on a new series of photographs. She reviewed images of weddings she had captured over the last few months, each one full of smiles and passionate looks, but they no longer managed to arouse the same emotion in her. On the contrary, they made her feel even more distant from what she had once believed to be true. The photos seemed to show something that no longer existed in her own life, and that suffocated her. As the afternoon progressed, Michael decided to go home early. Something was pulling him there, an intuition he couldn't ignore. He drove in silence, the radio off, lost in thought. When he parked in the garage, he noticed that something was different. There was no sound coming from inside the house, and the absence of movement was almost deafening. He walked in slowly, placing his briefcase on the floor. The clock on the wall indicated that it was too early for Emily to be asleep. He climbed the stairs slowly, listening to the creak of the steps. The bedroom door was ajar, and he carefully pushed it open, expecting to find Emily reading or perhaps reorganizing something in the closet, as she usually did when she wanted to unwind. But what he saw paralyzed him. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands shakily clutching her cell phone. When she heard the sound of the door opening, she looked up, panic taking over her expression. Michael didn't need to ask what was going on. The glow on her cell phone screen and her guilty expression were answers enough. "Michael," she began, her voice almost inaudible. He raised his hand, asking for silence. He approached her slowly, without taking his eyes off her. Emily tried to hide her cell phone, but to no avail. Michael took it from her hands and looked at the screen. Messages. Hundreds of them, coming from a number he didn't recognize. Words that, even without context, told a story he didn't want to hear. "Can you explain that?" Her voice was cold, controlled, but her eyes betrayed the storm roaring inside him. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Tears began to run down her face as she tried to find words to justify what was in front of them. But there was no justification. Her silence was deafening. For how long? Michael asked, his voice now filled with a pain he couldn't hide. How long have you been lying to me? Emily stammered, not knowing how to answer. Michael, I didn't want you to find out like this. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. He repeated, incredulity brimming through his words. You've destroyed everything, Emily. Everything we built, everything I believed to be real. And you still have the audacity to say it's not simple. She lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. Michael's every word was like a blade, cutting deep, but she knew she deserved it. She had made decisions that couldn't be undone, and now the weight of those choices was falling on her. Michael threw his cell phone on the bed and turned around, walking towards the door. I need to get out of here. I can't look at you now. Michael, please don't go like this, she begged, getting up and running to him. I've made a mistake. A terrible mistake, I know, but can't we sort it out some other way? He stopped, his hand already on the doorknob. He turned slowly, his gaze cold and empty. Do you think this is a mistake that can be solved? It's not a wrong account, Emily. It's a betrayal. You knew what you were doing. You knew the consequences. And you still chose to do it. He left without looking back, leaving her alone in the room. Emily fell to her knees, the sobs taking over her body as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The weight of her actions finally seemed real. Michael drove aimlessly for hours, his head spinning with thoughts and images that he desperately wanted to erase. The idea that Emily, the woman with whom he had shared years of his life, had been capable of something like this was unbearable. He parked in a deserted lot, sitting in the driver's seat, staring into the void. Betrayal was something he had never imagined he would face. He had always trusted Emily, believed that their love was strong enough to withstand anything. But now, as he stared at the horizon, he wondered how he could move on. Every memory seemed tainted, every promise broken. But something inside him began to change. A new question arose in his mind, something he hadn't considered before. And that question was like a spark, ready to set fire to everything he thought he knew. Silence hung thick over the room. Michael was sitting on the sofa in the living room, his face hard, his hands folded on his knees. On the other side of the room, Emily stood a few steps away from the dining table, staring at him as if trying to decipher his thoughts. The hours following the discovery of the betrayal had been a whirlwind, but now there was something else in the air. A different kind of tension. An unbearable weight. I need you to be honest with me now, he finally broke the silence, his voice low but laden with weight. Not just about what happened, but about everything. Emily hesitated, her gaze dancing between him and the floor. I've already told you what you wanted to know, she replied, but her voice was fragile, almost pleading. I know I hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable. But there's nothing more to it than that. Michael laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh. It was a bitter sound, of pure disbelief. Do you think I don't know there's more? Emily, I'm not an idiot. I've seen the messages. I know there's something bigger going on here. Michael, please, she began, but he held up his hand, cutting her off before she could continue. I want to hear it from you, he said, his eyes fixed on her. Not from someone else. I want you to tell me what you're hiding. Because, believe me, I'm going to find out anyway. There was a long silence. The kind of silence that seems to suck the air out of the room, leaving only tension. Emily swallowed, her hands shaking as she gripped the side of the table. She seemed to be fighting with herself, an internal battle that Michael could almost feel from across the room. Finally, she raised her eyes to him, and what he saw in them made his stomach turn. It wasn't guilt or regret. It was pure fear. It's not what you think, she began, and her voice was so low that he had to lean in slightly to hear. It's not just about him. It wasn't just a betrayal, Michael. Then what was it? He asked, anger beginning to bubble up under his forced calm. Because, so far, all I've heard are lame excuses. So tell me, Emily. Why did you do this? Why did you destroy what we had? She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment as if she needed to gather the courage to speak. When she finally opened her mouth, the words came out in a whirlwind, almost running over each other. I was desperate. I did something I knew was wrong, but at the time it seemed the only way out. Way out of what? Michael demanded, standing up now, unable to contain his frustration. What did you need to get out of? She flinched slightly, as if his intensity had startled her, but she didn't try to deflect the question. There were debts, Michael, she admitted, and her words fell like a stone between them. Things I hid from you. I was in trouble. Michael blinked, trying to process what she had just said. Debts? Trouble? None of these words made sense in the context of the life they shared. What are you talking about? We've always had our finances in order. You didn't have to hide anything from me. I know, she whispered, the tears now streaming freely down her face. I know I should have spoken to you. But I was afraid of how you would react. And then, someone offered to help. Michael's blood ran cold. He knew what was coming before she even said the words. Him, he said, more of a statement than a question. Emily nodded, barely able to face him. He said he could take care of everything. That he would help me out of the situation, but there was a price. And you were willing to pay it, Michael added, his voice now icy. With our marriage. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she insisted, her voice now filled with despair. I thought I could sort everything out before you found out. I thought I could fix everything and never have to tell you. Michael took a step back, as if he needed to put distance between them in order to breathe. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm of thoughts that was now roaring through his mind. Every piece of the puzzle was starting to fit together, and the picture it formed was far worse than he could have imagined. You got our marriage into debt with a man who knew exactly what he was doing, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and incredulity. And what else, Emily? What else are you hiding from me? She hesitated again, but knew there was no escape. He didn't stop, she admitted, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. Even after I tried to end it, he started making threats. He said that if I didn't carry on, he'd tell me everything. Michael felt as if the ground was collapsing beneath his feet. It wasn't just the betrayal that devastated him, but the manipulation, the web of lies that had been woven around him without him knowing. So, you didn't just destroy our marriage. You brought a dangerous man into our lives, he said, his tone sharp as a blade. I never wanted that to happen, Emily sobbed. I just wanted to protect you, protect what we had. Michael laughed again, but this time there was pure bitterness in his voice. Protect? You call that protecting? You lied to me, betrayed me, and now you're telling me you did it for me? What a joke. She fell to her knees, her head buried in her hands, unable to cope with the weight of her own actions. Michael, on the other hand, felt an unexpected clarity emerging through the pain. He knew that what was to come would be even more difficult than anything he had already faced. But above all, he knew he had to face the truth, no matter how much it devastated him. Michael didn't know how long he stood in the room, his mind in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Emily was still kneeling, a picture of regret and despair, but he felt nothing but a kind of growing emptiness. The weight of the situation seemed to crush him, as if the air around him was thicker. He needed answers, but above all, he needed to get out of that suffocating space. Without saying a word, he turned and walked to the door. Emily looked up immediately, her eyes red and swollen. Where are you going? She asked, her voice breaking. I need to think, he replied, without looking back. The door closed with a click, leaving her alone. Michael walked aimlessly down the street, the night lights reflecting in the puddles of rain that had fallen earlier. With every step, he relived Emily's words, each phrase echoing in his head like a bell. The idea that she had become involved with someone so deeply and dangerously was unbearable. But more than that, he was beginning to realize the larger implications of the situation. This wasn't just about betrayal or lies. It was about the fact that their lives were now intertwined with someone who seemed to have dark intentions. He ended up in a small, dimly lit bar, where the smell of stale wood and the murmur of discreet conversations welcomed him like an unexpected relief. He ordered a whiskey, something he rarely did, and sat down in the far corner of the bar. There, between slow sips, he began to organize his thoughts. He couldn't simply ignore what was happening, but he also didn't know where to start. Emily had mentioned threats. Did that mean he was at risk too? And what exactly did that man want? As he reflected, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He looked at the screen and saw Emily's name. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but he knew that running away from the conversation would only delay the inevitable. He picked up. "Michael," her voice sounded shaky on the other end. "I know you don't want to talk to me right now, but we need to talk. There are things you don't know yet." "Things I still don't know," he repeated, anger bubbling up again. "As if what you've already said isn't enough." "I understand," she replied, her voice breaking. "But, he came to me again. Today. After you left." Michael felt his heart race. "What did he say?" "He knows you found out," she confessed, each word carrying an unbearable weight. "And he said it changes everything." Michael closed his eyes, trying to remain calm. "What does he want, Emily? What's his goal?" "I don't know," she admitted, almost in a whisper. "But he wants to talk to you. He said that if you don't agree to meet him, he'll expose everything. Not just to you, but to everyone." The silence on the other end of the line was almost palpable. Michael knew he couldn't just ignore it. If that man was as dangerous as he seemed, letting him act unchecked was not an option. But the idea of confronting him was also terrifying. "Tell me where he wants to meet me," he finally said, his voice firm. Emily hesitated before answering. "At the old industrial shed, near the highway. He said he'll be there at 10. Michael looked at his watch. It was less than an hour away. He finished his whiskey in one gulp, paid the bill and left the bar. The cold night wind enveloped him as he made his way to his car. All the way, his mind was a mixture of anger, fear and growing determination. He knew that this meeting wouldn't just be about answers. It would be about regaining control of his life. When he arrived at the shed, the scene looked like something out of a thriller movie. The place was deserted, except for a car parked under a lamppost, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. Michael got out of the car and walked towards the entrance, where a male figure was standing, waiting. "You must be Michael," the man said, his voice calm, almost casual. He was tall, confident-looking, with a smile that radiated a false cordiality. "And you must be the man who destroyed my marriage," Michael replied, without hiding the contempt in his voice. "Oh, that?" the man laughed, as if the accusation was something trivial. "I'd say it was a mutual collaboration. But we're not here to discuss that, right? We're here to talk about the future. What do you want?" Michael cut in, with no patience for games. The man's smile disappeared, replaced by a serious expression. "I want something simple, your silence." Michael frowned. "Silence about what?" "About how you manipulate vulnerable women. About how you destroy lives." "Don't be so melodramatic," the man retorted, crossing his arms. "I have information that you wouldn't want made public. Information that could ruin more than just your marriage." Michael took a step forward, his body tense. "If you think I'm going to give in to your threats, you're sorely mistaken." "They're not threats," the man replied, leaning in slightly. "They're facts. And if you're smart, you'll see that what I'm asking is a low price for keeping your reputation intact." Michael felt his blood boil, but he knew that losing control at that moment wouldn't help. He needed to understand exactly what he was up against before making any decisions. "And what exactly do you have against me?" The man smiled again, but this time there was something cruel in his expression. He flipped open his phone and showed a series of photos and documents that made Michael's stomach turn. It wasn't just about Emily. It was something bigger, something he hadn't imagined. And at that moment, he realized that what was in front of him was much more than a simple betrayal. It was a carefully planned trap, and he was the ultimate target. Michael stared at the man in front of him, the coldness in the air contrasting with the whirlwind inside his mind. The images and documents he had just seen seemed to defy all the reality he knew. It wasn't just about the broken marriage or Emily's lies. There was something bigger at stake, something that threatened to go beyond the boundaries of his personal life and affect his career, his integrity and, above all, what he still believed to be his sense of justice. "So, are you going to do what I'm asking, or would you rather risk everything?" The man spoke with the confidence of someone who knew he had control over the situation, a slight smile on his lips as if he was completely convinced that Michael would give in. Michael took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. His initial instinct was to confront the man, to end this once and for all, but logic prevented him from acting impulsively. He knew that one wrong move could destroy any chance of getting out of the situation with dignity. "Do you think that's power?" Michael finally asked, his voice firm but controlled. "Manipulating people, forcing them to live in fear. Does that give you satisfaction?" The man laughed quietly, crossing his arms. "Power isn't about satisfaction, Michael. It's about control. And right now, I have control over you." Michael held the man's gaze, refusing to look away. "You may have control now, but it won't last. Because people like you make mistakes. You think you're above it all, but in the end, you always leave loose ends. And I'm going to find yours." The answer seemed to shake the man for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Good luck with that," he replied, stepping back slightly. "But while you're busy trying to defeat me, perhaps you should ask yourself, how many other people might be affected? Your wife. Your colleagues. And, of course, yourself. It's a high price to pay." Michael stood motionless as the man drove away, getting into his car and disappearing into the darkness. He stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Everything seemed surreal, as if he was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. When he finally got back into the car, he felt the weight of the last few hours fall on him. The drive home was a blur, each thought blending into the next in a spiral of uncertainty. As he parked in the garage, he saw that the house lights were still on. Emily was awake, waiting for him. When he came in, he found her sitting on the sofa, her eyes red from crying. She stood up when she saw him, but hesitated before speaking. "Did you find him?" Her question was almost a whisper. "I found him," Michael replied, taking off his jacket and throwing it on a nearby chair. He didn't look directly at her as he spoke, still processing the conflicting emotions. "And, what did he say?" Emily insisted, the nervousness evident in her voice. "He said he wants silence. That if I don't cooperate, he'll destroy everything." He finally turned to face her. "And you know what's worse? He might actually do it." Emily put her hand to her mouth, as if trying to stifle a sob. "Michael, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. Stop." He held up his hand, interrupting her. "I don't want to hear excuses right now. What I want is to understand how we're going to get out of this." She nodded, drying her tears quickly. "I'm going to do whatever it takes to help. I'll talk to him again, try to convince him to let it go." Michael laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Do you really think he'll listen to you? He's playing a game, Emily. And we're just pieces on his board." "So what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice laden with despair. Michael took a deep breath, looking at her with an intensity that made her recoil slightly. "We're going to do what he least expects. Let's expose the truth." Emily stared at him with a mixture of shock and fear. "Expose it? But that could destroy us. You could lose everything, Michael." "Maybe," he admitted. "But if we keep quiet, he'll continue to control our lives. And I'm not going to live like that. I'd rather face the consequences than be manipulated by someone like him." There was a long silence as Emily digested his words. Finally, she nodded slowly, although the fear in her eyes was still evident. "If that's your decision, I'm with you." In the days that followed, Michael began to gather everything he could about the man who was threatening them. He hired a private investigator to track his every move, every transaction, every suspicious interaction. The more he discovered, the more it became clear that this man wasn't just an opportunist. He was a predator, someone who fed on the weaknesses of others in order to accumulate power. Meanwhile, Emily was doing her part. She delved into her memories, looking for any detail that might be useful, any clue that Michael could use to dismantle the web of lies the man had built. It wasn't easy for her to face her past, but for the first time, she felt that she was really helping to repair something that she had helped to destroy. The nights were the hardest. Michael and Emily rarely exchanged more than a few words before retiring for the night. The distance between them was palpable, and they both knew that, regardless of the outcome, something between them had changed forever. Finally, the investigator brought the information Michael needed. There were incriminating documents, connections with other people who had been victims, even evidence of illegal activities. Michael knew he had enough to take this to the authorities, but he also knew that doing so meant exposing his own life and Emily's to public scrutiny. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table for the first time in weeks, he placed the documents in front of her. "This is it," he said. "This is what we have against him. But it's also what could end us." Emily looked at the papers, her hand trembling slightly as she touched them. "Do you really think it's worth risking everything?" "I think it's the only way to regain control," he replied, the determination clear in his voice. "But this isn't just my decision. It's ours." She stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then let's do it. Together." And for the first time in weeks, Michael felt a spark of something he had thought he had lost forever. A spark of hope. Michael was sitting on the wooden bench in the courtroom, his fingers intertwined as he awaited the verdict that would define the next chapter of his life. The case had been more difficult than he had imagined. The man who threatened him, the manipulator who had thrown his life into chaos, was not only cunning, but also dangerous. Still, Michael knew there was no other way. Facing him meant not only fighting for his dignity, but also protecting other people who might fall victim in the future. Emily stood next to him, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the floor. For weeks, she had worked alongside Michael to dismantle the scheme, delving into documents, taking part in difficult interviews and dealing with the weight of the choices she had made. She knew that her role in all of this was a mixture of redemption and debt. It was the only way she could try to right the wrongs that had put them in that situation. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge read out the verdict. The manipulator had been convicted, his web of lies and crimes exposed, but the process had left deep scars. The media exploited every detail of the case, digging up information about Emily's involvement and questioning Michael's stability as a public figure. Even with their victory in court, they knew their lives would never be the same. As they left the courtroom, Emily looked at Michael, her eyes watering. "I don't know how to begin to thank you for standing up to me. For giving me a chance to put things right." Michael stared at her for a moment, his expression indecipherable. "I didn't do it for you, Emily. I did it for me. I did it because I needed to put an end to it. Because living in fear or shame wasn't an option." She nodded, understanding his words. The distance between them seemed insurmountable, but she knew she couldn't hope for more than that. The damage she had caused was irreparable, and as much as she wanted to believe in a fresh start, the reality was much crueler. Weeks passed since the trial, and Michael plunged into his new routine. He had resigned from the company where he had worked for years, unable to cope after everything that had come to light. He moved to a smaller house, away from his old neighborhood, and began to rebuild his life little by little. The nights were still difficult, haunted by memories and doubts, but there was also a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt for a long time. For the first time, he was living for himself, without carrying the weight of maintaining a facade of perfection. Emily, for her part, decided to leave town. With her reputation tarnished and her social relationships shattered, she knew she needed a fresh start elsewhere. She found a modest job as an assistant in a photography studio in a small town, where no one knew her name or her story. There, she began to rebuild not only her life, but also her identity. Although she knew she could never undo what she had done, she strove to find some form of peace, even if it was a slow and painful process. As for the manipulator, his conviction brought a definitive end to his influence, but the impact of his actions still echoed in the lives of his victims. During the trial, other cases came to light, and the extent of his crimes shocked even the most cynical. Justice, albeit slow, finally came for him, but not without leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Michael found a new purpose in his life. He began working as an independent consultant, helping small businesses avoid legal and financial pitfalls like the ones that almost destroyed his life. In the midst of this, he began to reconnect with people who had been sidelined during his marriage. Old friends, his sister, even college classmates he had lost track of. Little by little, he rediscovered who he was without the shadow of a relationship that had become toxic. One day, while walking in the park, he met someone who changed his perspective on the future. It was a woman with a kind smile and an energy that seemed to light up the room. Her name was Sarah, and she was reading a book while her dog ran across the lawn. The conversation began casually, but over the course of weeks evolved into something deeper. Michael still bore the scars of his past, but for the first time he felt it was possible to move on without letting those scars define who he was. In her new life, Emily started attending a support group for people trying to overcome past mistakes. It was there that she began to understand the depth of the choices she had made and to find a way to deal with her regrets. Although she knew she could never fully repair what she had done to Michael, she finally found the strength to forgive herself and, with that, build a different life. In the end, they each found their own way. Michael, now stronger and more aware of who he was, found a new chance to love and be loved. Emily, carrying the weight of her mistakes, found a purpose in helping other people not to make the same mistakes. And although their paths never crossed again, they both learned that, even in the midst of pain and betrayal, there was a way to start again. If you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave a comment with your opinion and tell us what struck you most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future stories. Remember, we don't support any kind of betrayal here. The stories are fictional, but they show how choices can affect lives irreversibly. See you next time.